I woke up from a strange feeling of anxiety. The house was too quiet, even for early morning. There was something wrong with this silence, something oppressive. My hand instinctively reached for the empty side of the bed, expecting to feel Paul's warmth, but instead my fingers touched the cold, smooth sheet. Paul was already up, as always, before me. I didn't know why this made my heart skip a beat, but the feeling of emptiness inside became more insistent. I got out of bed and put on a robe, trying to shake off the silly feeling. Everything was fine, I told myself. Paul was probably in the kitchen with the morning newspaper, or in the garden with coffee. He always started his day the same way, like clockwork. This was Paul, my husband, the man I had spent 30 years of my life with, the perfect man as everyone around thought. But today I couldn't shake the thought that something had changed. Something subtly wrong had crept into our lives, and I couldn't figure out what it was. I slowly went downstairs, my bare feet sliding over the cool wood. The sound was muffled, almost inaudible, as if I instinctively feared breaking the silence. When I reached the kitchen, Paul was there, but instead of his usual pose, sitting at the table, buried in the newspaper, he was standing by the window, his back tense, shoulders hunched. Next to him, on the counter, was his phone. I noticed how he quickly turned his head when he heard my steps and immediately locked the screen. "Good morning." His voice was soft, but I felt something artificial in it. "Morning," I replied, studying his face. He smiled at me, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. Paul rarely could hide his emotions, and now he was definitely hiding something. "You look tense," I noted, coming closer. "No, just thinking about the project," he said too quickly, and this haste made me frown. Anxiety began to stir inside me, like a living being. I tried to understand what exactly was bothering me, but this feeling was slippery, elusive from logic. I decided not to insist and turned away, taking a cup to pour myself some coffee. But out of the corner of my eye, I still watched him. "Were you on the phone for a long time?" I asked, trying to make my voice light. "Not very," he said, shrugging. "It was just a work call." But I noticed how his fingers clenched into a fist, as if his own hands were giving him away. At that moment, I felt it. Something was happening. Paul was lying to me. And for the first time in 30 years, I knew it clearly. The anxiety didn't leave me all day. Even after Paul left for work and Liam and Nathan, his younger brothers, temporarily living with us, went out, I couldn't find a place for myself. This strange silence that I felt since morning haunted me. Time flowed slowly, as if the very space conspired to remind me that nothing in my life would ever be the same. By evening, when Paul returned home, I tried to make myself not notice his evasive answers, his nervous gestures. But when he disappeared upstairs and I was left alone in the kitchen, my eyes fell on his phone, which he had forgotten on the counter. He never did that. Paul always kept it with him, like a wallet or keys. My hand reached for it before I could think. I knew it was wrong. I knew that if I opened this phone, my life might never be the same again. But something inside me, relentless and fierce, demanded the truth. The phone was locked, but the screen lit up for a moment, showing the last notification. One name, highlighted in blue light. Jasmine. My stomach twisted. Jasmine, the young neighbor girl who was always so nice to us. The one who always rang the doorbell with warm buns and a sunny smile. Her. At that moment, I felt the ground beneath me shift, as if an invisible blow hit me, and I realized that everything I knew about my life was about to crumble. Paul was sitting at the table in the living room, his gaze focused on the laptop screen. His fingers slowly tapped the keys, as if he was about to write something important, but couldn't concentrate. Liam and Nathan were making noise in the kitchen, arguing over who should clean the dishes. It seemed like a normal evening, but there was a tension in the air that no one but me noticed. I watched Paul from the corner of the room, trying to be invisible. His face was too calm, too detached to be reassuring. He didn't even look up when Liam loudly slammed the cabinet door. "Honestly, Nate, you've been dodging the cleaning for a week now," Liam grumbled, his deep voice filled with irritation. "Come on, bro, relax," Nathan laughed, his boyish smile always lightening the mood. "I cooked. That counts." "It only counts in your imagination," Liam threw a towel at him. I could have smiled if the anxiety inside me wasn't boiling. At that moment, I wanted to stop them, ask them to be quieter, but the words stuck in my throat. In my head, one name kept spinning. Jasmine. Paul interrupted my thoughts with his voice. Angela, you're so quiet today. Is everything okay? He finally looked up, and I met his gaze. Everything's fine, I replied, forcing myself to smile. Just a little tired. He nodded, but his eyes lingered on me a bit longer than usual. I felt like he was trying to read something in my face, but I wasn't going to give him the slightest hint of my suspicions. Why don't you rest? He suggested. Maybe I'll make you some tea. I nodded, unable to say anything else. Paul got up, heading to the kitchen, leaving me alone with Liam and Nathan, who were now discussing something much calmer. But I couldn't distract myself. Questions buzzed in my head like annoying flies. Why Jasmine? Why her? And how long had this been going on? When Paul returned with a cup of tea, I tried to take it, but my hands shook slightly. Ang, are you sure everything's okay? He asked again, his voice soft, but I couldn't help but hear the falseness in it. Yes, I lied, turning away so he wouldn't see my eyes. Later that night, when everyone had gone to their rooms, I was left alone in the living room. Memories flashed through my head. Paul's voice, Jasmine's laughter, her bright smile. It seemed like all these images were now distorted. I couldn't stay inactive any longer. My gaze fell on Paul's phone, left on the kitchen counter. The chance to know the truth was too tempting. My heart beat heavily and dully as I picked it up. Password. Of course, it was locked. Damn, I whispered. But then I remembered. I had seen him enter it before. 6 digits, our children's birthday. I entered the code, and to my surprise, the screen unlocked. My breath became ragged. I knew this was an invasion of his privacy, but my mind screamed that I had the right to know. Opening the messages, I saw her name. Jasmine. The conversation started innocently. General questions, jokes. But the further I scrolled, the clearer the truth became. Her responses were flirtatious, full of hints. His were not as obvious, but enough to understand that this was not just friendship. You really make me feel young, he wrote. Because you are, she replied with a heart emoji. My heart clenched. Anger and pain washed over me in a wave, but I couldn't stop. The conversation continued late into the night, and I knew this was more. Much more. Suddenly, there was a noise upstairs. I quickly locked the phone and put it back. Paul was coming down the stairs. You're still not asleep? His voice was full of fatigue. Couldn't sleep, I replied, trying to sound calm. He nodded, walking past me. I watched him until he disappeared into the kitchen. At that moment, I realized it wasn't him who lost control of the situation. It was me who took it away. The silence in the house was deceptive. Everything seemed as usual. Paul went to work, Liam and Nathan chatted over a cup of coffee in the kitchen, and I sat by the window with a book I couldn't read. The letters blurred before my eyes because my thoughts were still clinging to last night, to the conversation, to every treacherous word I read. I felt anger boiling inside me, spreading through my veins like poison. Paul, the man I trusted most in the world, was cheating on me. And Jasmine, the girl I had known since childhood, looked me in the eye and smiled, knowing all along that she was part of this lie. Angela, are you okay? Liam's voice pulled me out of my thoughts. I looked up and saw him standing in the living room doorway. His face was serious, his gaze soft but attentive. Yes, just thinking, I replied, trying to smile. He didn't look convinced. His dark eyes lingered on me a bit longer than usual, as if he was trying to read something in my face. Finally, he slightly tilted his head. Are you sure? You look upset. I wanted to say something light, brush it off, but his words touched something inside me. For the first time in the past few days, I felt like someone really noticed that something was wrong with me. I lowered my eyes, trying to hide my emotions. Just tired, I said quietly. Liam came closer and sat down across from me. His presence was calm, almost comforting. He didn't say a word, just waited, giving me space. Is it Paul? He finally asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. I looked up, surprised at how quickly he guessed. Liam was always observant, even too much so. I couldn't understand what exactly he knew or suspected, but his gaze said he was ready to listen. Why do you think so? I asked, trying to sound casual. He shrugged, but there was caution in his movement. You look out the window too much, he said with a slight smile, and that's always a sign that someone is deeply thinking about something important. I couldn't help but give a weak smile, but instead of answering, I just nodded. Talking about Paul with his brother seemed too strange, but at the same time, Liam was the only person in the house who showed me genuine attention. His gaze, his words, all of it was a quiet reminder that I was still alive, still able to feel. Nathan peeked into the room, his mischievous smile instantly softening the atmosphere. "Oh, so you're keeping secrets without me?" he said, sitting on the armrest of the chair. "That's not fair." Liam rolled his eyes. "Not everything revolves around you, Nate." "Oh, but I like to think it does." Nathan laughed, giving me a playful look. "Seriously, Angela, you look like you need to unwind. Why don't we go out somewhere together? Drink, have dinner, anything." His suggestion caught me off guard. I looked at him, trying to understand if he was joking or serious. His green eyes looked at me with such a warm and at the same time mischievous expression that I felt a smile appear on my face. "I don't think that's a good idea," I replied. "Why not?" Nathan leaned closer. "You deserve a little fun, and who better than the two of us to provide it?" Liam snorted. "Because you'll come up with something crazy," he said, but a smile flashed across his face. I looked at both of them, so different, but both right in their own way. I really needed something to shake me out of this state, but not just fun. I needed more. I needed to regain control, to feel strong. And then an idea was born in my head. Later that evening, when Paul was late from work and Liam and Nathan were watching TV in the living room, I went downstairs. My dress was a bit more fitted than usual, and my hair flowed freely over my shoulders. My heels clicked on the wooden floor as I entered the room. Both brothers turned around at the same time. Their gazes lingered on me a bit longer than usual. Nathan raised an eyebrow and said with a slight smile, "You look stunning tonight, Angela." "Where are you headed?" "Nowhere," I replied with a soft smile. "I just felt like dressing up a bit. Sometimes women need that." Liam remained silent, but his gaze said more than words. I felt their attention filling me with strength. This was the beginning of something new, something dangerous. The house was enveloped in silence. The clock on the wall ticked away the minutes, but I barely heard them, too focused on my own thoughts. Paul had gone to a meeting with colleagues and wouldn't be back until midnight. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. I went downstairs trying to convince myself that everything I was about to do was just an innocent test of boundaries. But deep down, I knew this night would change everything. Liam and Nathan were sitting in the living room. Liam was thoughtfully flipping through a book, his dark eyes scanning the lines with concentration that always attracted my attention. He exuded a calmness that seemed to hold the whole world on his shoulders. Nathan, on the other hand, was watching an action movie, laughing at the witty lines of the heroes. His energy was refreshing, light, but underneath it was something wild, as if he was just waiting for the right moment to break free. I entered the room. The red silk dress smoothly slid over my thighs, its deep neckline accentuating my curves, leaving no room for doubt. My hair, loose over my shoulders, softly touched my neck. This wasn't me, Angela, the wife, who cooked dinners and comforted her husband. This was a woman who knew what she wanted and was ready to take it. The sound of my heels made them both turn around. Nathan was the first to break the silence, his green eyes widening in surprise, and a smirk appeared on his lips. "Wow, Angela," he drawled, looking me up and down. "You look just stunning. Going on a date?" I allowed myself a slight smile, but there was something playful, almost defiant in my gaze. "No," I said softly, coming closer. "I'm here for you." Liam tensed. His book closed, his fingers clutching the cover harder than necessary. His eyes, dark and deep, like a stormy sea, met mine. He didn't say a word, but his gaze spoke volumes. Confusion, desire, and at the same time, inner struggle. "For us?" Nathan laughed, but there was a huskiness in his voice. He stood up and took a step towards me. That's interesting. Are you serious? I came closer, feeling the tension in the room becoming almost tangible. My gaze slid from Nathan to Liam. Both were so different, but at that moment I felt them equally. Their attention was riveted on me. Their breathing slowed, as if time had stopped. You two are so different, I whispered, stopping in the center of the room. But you have one thing in common. You both make me feel alive. Liam shook his head, his voice low and tense. Angela, this is wrong. Paul ... Paul doesn't care, I interrupted, feeling my emotions bursting out. If he cared, he wouldn't have done what he did. He doesn't look at me the way you look at me. I fell silent, watching their reaction. Nathan took another step closer, his green eyes sparkling with excitement. Are you sure you want this? He asked, his voice softer but deeper. I've never been more sure, I replied. He reached out, his fingertips gently touching my hand. His touch was soft, but there was an energy in it that made my breath catch. I felt goosebumps run down my skin, and at that moment, I knew there was no turning back. Liam stood up, his movements slow and careful, as if he was afraid to break something fragile. His dark eyes met mine, and I felt his fingers gently touch my chin, almost reverently. Are you sure? He asked, and in his voice there was so much pain and desire that I almost cried. Yes, I whispered, and that was enough. Nathan slid closer, his lips finding mine. The kiss was hot, hungry, as if he had been waiting for this moment all his life. His hands slid down my back, pulling me closer. I felt his breath burning my skin, his touches causing me to shiver. Liam did not back down. His lips found my neck gently, as if he was studying every inch of my skin. His hands were more hesitant, but this only intensified the effect. He took his time, his touches gentle but insistent, as if he wanted to remember every second. I found myself between them, their warmth surrounding me like a cocoon. My hands slid over Nathan's shoulders, then over Liam's chest. The feeling of their skin under my fingers was so real, so tangible, that I felt time and reality losing their significance. You are incredible, Liam whispered, his voice trembling. This is crazy, Nathan added, but his smile said he was enjoying every second. I looked at both of them, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. They looked at me in a way no one had in many years. Desire in their eyes was so strong that it flooded me, made me forget about everything else. That night was ours, and for the first time in a long time, I felt strong, desired, alive. The house woke up to the soft rustle of sunlight filtering through the curtains. But for me, the morning was unusually bright. I lay in my bed alone, but the warmth and memories of the night still lingered on my skin, like echoes of a storm I had summoned. I allowed myself to linger in bed a little longer, reflecting. Liam and Nathan, their touches, their words. It was all too real, too alive to be a mistake. But along with that feeling came fear. If Paul finds out, everything will crumble. And yet, every time I remembered how his hands slid over someone else's skin, how his lips found her neck, all my guilt dissolved, melting away in the memories of betrayal. When I went downstairs, Liam was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. His gaze was focused on the newspaper, but his posture, his tense shoulders, told me he was waiting for my appearance. I noticed how his hand paused for a moment when he heard my steps. Good morning, I said, trying to keep my voice light. He looked up, and there was something in his eyes that made my heart ache. There was desire, but also worry. Morning, he replied, but his voice sounded hoarse, as if he hadn't slept all night. How are you? I paused for a moment. How am I? It's hard to answer that question when your life is about to explode. Instead, I smiled, pretending everything was fine. I am okay. And you? Liam looked away, taking a sip of coffee. His fingers nervously tapped the table. Honestly, I don't know, he finally admitted. Last night, it was, something. His words made me feel a slight tingling in my chest. He was trying to find the words, but his eyes said more than he could express. He was struggling with himself, with what had happened, and perhaps with what he wanted to happen again. Before I could respond, Nathan burst into the room, his energy instantly refreshing the atmosphere. He was the same as always, light, confident, but there was something new in his smile, something that made me feel trapped. "Oh, good morning, Queen of the Night," he said, winking at me. "Nathan," Liam interjected, his voice firmer. "Enough." "What? We're all adults. No one forced anyone, right?" His gaze flicked to me, and I felt my cheeks flush slightly. I wanted to say something that would put him in his place, but instead I just shook my head. "It was just a moment," I finally said, but my words sounded unconvincing even to myself. Liam frowned, his gaze becoming heavier. "Just a moment?" he asked, his voice colder than I was used to. "Angela, it wasn't just a moment." Nathan looked at both of us, his smile wavering, but he quickly regained his composure. "Come on, guys, don't be so tense. What happened happened. No pressure, no obligations. It's all simple, right?" But there was nothing simple about it. The atmosphere in the room became thick, like fog. I felt the tension between the three of us growing, ready to explode. Nathan, trying to lighten the mood, laughed and patted Liam on the shoulder. "Bro, relax. It'll all be fine." But Liam just shook his head. "You don't understand, Nate. You never think about the consequences," he said, and his words were surprisingly bitter. "And you always think too much," Nathan snapped, his tone sharper. "Maybe you should relax for once in your life." I intervened, trying to ease the tension. "Stop," I said, standing between them. "We can't let this ruin us. This was our secret, and let's keep it that way." Liam looked at me, his gaze full of doubt, but in the end, he nodded. "Okay, but if Paul finds out—" "He won't," I said firmly. All day I tried to avoid them both. Every glance, every casual gesture reminded me of what had happened. My heart wavered between guilt and desire, between fear and excitement. But every time I remembered Paul's face, his lies, his betrayal, I felt justified. If he could so easily betray me, why should I remain faithful? But that night, when Paul finally returned home, his smile was even. But it seemed fake to me. I watched him, watched how he carefully avoided my gaze, how he acted as if nothing had happened. He didn't even suspect that a storm had already entered his home. The house was enveloped in silence, but this time it felt ominous. Everything I had done over the past few days had led to this moment. I felt like a spider pulling threads in its web, but with each thread I added, the web became more complex. And now, looking into Paul's face, I knew that this web was about to collapse. Paul was sitting across from me at the kitchen table, his gaze focused on the cup of coffee in his hands. He still didn't know. He still lived in the illusion of control, in a world where he was the main player. But I was no longer the woman who sat quietly, accepting his lies. "Angela, you look strange today," he finally said, breaking the silence. I smiled, but there was no warmth in that smile. "Strange? Maybe because I've realized a lot," I said, looking at him over my cup of tea. "Maybe that's why." He frowned, clearly confused. "What do you mean?" I set the cup down, allowing him to feel the weight of my words. "You know, Paul, trust is a strange thing. You build it for years, put your soul into it, and then it crumbles in a second." He tensed, his fingers gripped the cup a little too tightly. "Are you saying I did something wrong?" I allowed the pause to linger, savoring this moment. Then I stood up and walked around the table, stopping next to him. "What do you think?" I asked, looking him straight in the eyes. His face paled. He understood. His mouth opened, but no words came out. At that moment, I saw fear and attempted justification battling within him. "Angela, I can explain. It was a mistake. It will never happen again." I laughed, but the laughter was bitter. "A mistake? Was Jasmine a mistake? Were the messages you sent her a mistake? Was cheating on me in our marital bed a mistake?" His face contorted in horror. "You know." "Yes, I know, Paul," I interrupted him. "And not just know. I realized that our life, which I thought was perfect, was a lie. You were a lie." At that moment, Liam and Nathan entered the room. Their faces were tense. They stopped in the doorway, clearly sensing that the atmosphere in the room was charged. Paul turned to them, his gaze darting between them and me. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice hoarse. I stepped forward, addressing them. "It's okay. We're just finishing up." Liam made a movement as if he wanted to say something, but I gestured for him to stop. At that moment, I felt that all the strength I had gained belonged only to me. "Paul, you've always been someone who thought he was above others. You thought you could do anything and no one would notice. But you were wrong, and I want you to know that. I'm no longer the woman who turns a blind eye to your betrayal." His face turned crimson, and he stood up, trying to look menacing. "And what are you going to do, Angela?" "Leave? That's ridiculous," I smirked. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't waver. "Leave? No, Paul. I've already done what I wanted. You just don't know that you've already lost." He looked at Liam and Nathan, then back at me. His eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" I allowed my gaze to slide to his younger brothers, then back to him. "I found solace, Paul, where you least expected it." His face turned ashen. He understood. Liam looked away, his jaw tense, and Nathan just crossed his arms, his face stony. You couldn't." His voice trembled, and it was a sweet triumph. "Oh, I could, Paul," I replied. "And you know what? I enjoyed it." I turned and headed for the exit, leaving him alone in the ruined web he had woven himself. Behind me, I heard him slump back into the chair. Liam and Nathan remained behind, but I knew they would understand. They were part of this game, part of my freedom. At that moment, I felt not only the bitterness of revenge, but also its sweetness. I was no longer a victim. I had become the mistress of my own destiny.